Hello, everybody. Thinking about disinformation made me think about intelligence, or makes us think about intelligence as analysts, whether we're media scholars, sociologists, philosophers, or what information scientists, whatever. And to think about information as intelligence, which thinking about disinformation made me do this, especially in the context of Ukraine. Makes us reconsider what information is, but makes us think about it as intelligence, information as intelligence. So first, I was thinking of some examples. And for the last 3 or 4 weeks, tend to make a note. I'm listening to podcasts all the time from The Economist, from various experts on Ukraine. I make a note on, where's disinformation? So there's a lot of disinformation and information in the war in Ukraine. Well, first, the Russians keep saying that Ukraine is Nazi, which is kind of strange, but probably the original Nazi German incursions into Russia in World War II, in which it was always seen as Nazis. That's the first thing. One bit of big disinformation. Oh, Russia says that when Russia thinks about using chemical or biological or even nuclear warfare, they say, oh, Ukraine's going to do this, which is another ridiculous bit of disinformation. What else does Putin and Russia say? That Zelensky is a tool of NATO, that the whole of Ukraine is being used as a tool of NATO. That's a complex one. But he's not just a tool of NATO. He was elected with a huge majority in a free election to replace a much less competent prime minister who himself was replacing somebody who was a tool of Russia. Another bit of disinformation, but this disinformation really is propaganda, the old kind of Soviet propaganda. The Chinese press, for example, publishes a lot of what the Russians say as if it were fact. So the state control and party controlled Chinese press, although they haven't been supporting Russia with weapons, the way that NATO has big time, of course, supported Ukraine, Chinese press publishes Russian disinformation as if it were fact. Another thing of disinformation, Russia is disinformed its citizens by saying that it's not a war, but it's a special military operation. How many times you've heard all this in Korea, of course. Not only is that propaganda, but the Russian soldiers, especially the rank and file soldiers, believe that it's not a war until they cross over into Ukraine. And then they find out it is one, and that 15,000 have died or more. So, and that kind of disinformation, because they don't want to frighten or whatever, the Russian soldiers, they want to minimize what it is, makes the Russian war effort much weaker. So it's funny, Putin's disinformation weakens his own side. Now I think they might say that it is a war on May 9th, which I think is the anniversary of the end of World War II. They might say that it is a war, partly because Russians been using a professional army and not conscription, not the draft. And they'll probably have to use conscription because they're losing so badly. But what they've done is they've even used conscription and made people convert to professional, which is really weird. But they'll probably have to announce it on the 9th of May. So that's another case of disinformation. Thinking of all these cases, Vostok was, what Russia did was it hugely modernized its army between 2010 and 2020. It had all the stuff on show with the troops on Vostok. You see in the PowerPoint, which is in Siberia. These incredible military exercises, but even those were disinformation in that they used misleading numbers. They made the number of troops 5 times as high as it was, the amount of equipment too, but still they're hugely modernized equipment. I mean, one thing about that Russia's been telling the truth on is about the expansion of NATO. I don't want to be just one-sided in this. I mean, not because I care about being partial or impartial, but because NATO expanded vastly after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And what they did is they took in Poland and the Baltic countries and a number of other countries. And they promised, George W. Bush's father, said that NATO would not expand, but it did. And you can see that's was hugely upsetting to Putin and any kind of balance of power politics. I mean, the NATO nations voted to join NATO. So it's a complex thing, but did NATO have to offer them membership? Well, maybe it did. I mean, what would Poland be without NATO today? The war has not just been about disinformation, but it's about huge increases in the very mass of information. Yeah. So, I mean, how did the US and the UK know that Russia was going to invade? Putin didn't say it. He said he wouldn't, but a huge number of troops were massed. But Ukraine thought they wouldn't invade. France thought they wouldn't invade. Germany thought they wouldn't invade. Poland thought they wouldn't invade. How did the US know? Well, they were tapping phones. They were using satellite technology and getting all sorts of inside information that they wouldn't otherwise have got. I mean, it's that the technology made that much more real information available. There is a lot more information out there. You know, there's video clips of everything now. These people have their phones. So there's phone clips of every atrocity, of everything. So there's way more real information out there. So although there's disinformation, there's much more information for the public, especially video, image information. But everybody thought the war would be over in about 2 weeks, or a week or less, and that Russia would take Kiev 4 or 5 days, 3 days. Not only the Russians thought so, so did the Americans. I wonder why that was. Well, there clearly, there wasn't good enough quality information to know it. I mean, everybody thought that it would be like the US in Iraq, the kind of shock and awe, where the US took Baghdad in about a day or two. I don't know what Zelensky and the Ukrainians, so I guess they probably knew that they would be a really good fighting force and that there would be all that heroism. But the US thought that Russia would take Kyiv, as the Russians did, in no time at all. So that's got to do with the quality of information about, but also maybe the frame in which people were thinking. Because information also has something to do with frames, I think. And those frames, the frame in this sense was about the very quality of the Ukrainian army, but also the dreadfully poor quality of the Russian army. I mean, the Russian army, for example, were using food for the troops that was past its sell-by. The troops weren't trained. They didn't know what they were getting into. They've been horrible. They've, raped and they've murdered and they've tortured. And they've left. They've quit. They've run. So the troops have been incredibly. They've not been able to do anything, and also there's been a huge amount of corruption, not just in the old Chinese army. Chinese armies got rid of a lot of that corruption, but corruption, things like getting army contracts, maybe generals, who knows, and then taking the money from the state and then buying cheap equipment. For example, they bought cheap Chinese tires for the tanks, and these tires just kind of couldn't get through the mud in Ukraine. So that's again, poor quality information, corruption. I mean, corruption leads to distrust, of course, but is also about the quality of information. It's kind of interesting. There's big parallels between Iraq is now it's a long time ago. It's 19 years ago. So 9/11 was 21 years ago, Iraq 19 years ago, Russia's war in Georgia, 2004. Now, Iraq, do you remember? the aim of the war, George W. Bush this time, was disarming the Iraqis and also regime change. Yeah, get rid of Saddam Hussein, and they got both. Russia has used the same language in Ukraine. Disarm Ukraine. They all use it all the time. Disarm Ukraine, not just out of NATO, disarm Ukraine, but also regime change. Get Zelensky. They haven't been able to. The funny thing, of course, is that kind of on the quiet, Biden and the Americans really would love to force regime change in Russia. So frames, I think, here are important. As I said before, neither the US nor even Russia, Putin didn't know how weak Russia was militarily. US didn't know it all either. Yeah, the Russian army was a mess after the 2004 Georgia war. Georgia, a little country with 3 million people. Another one of Russians. Putin, they've got a bad economy, and all he's got is violence at his hands. Like in Syria, you bombard them, which is an old, even pre-communist, czarist tactic. Use artillery. Don't engage in hand-to-hand. Destroy everything through artillery, as we can see, everything getting destroyed through artillery in Ukraine instead of hand-to-hand fighting. So yeah, there's huge modernization of the Russian military, 2010 to 20, doubled their spending to 250 billion USD a year, 3 times what the UK and France have on military spending. That's in terms of purchasing power, because of course the purchasing power and exchange rate, GDPs are completely different. I think it was Leon Trotsky, who said a military is the society writ large, only more dangerous, only more toxic. And Russian society is toxic. The whole society is toxic. There's corruption right through. So there's corruption in the military. Again, disinformation. When you have a bunch of yes men in the top jobs in the military and in the Ministry of Defense, don't want to say to Putin what the truth is if they know. So first of all, there have been huge blocks in communication between the top generals and the Ministry of Defense in Russia, partly because of really bad technology, and secondly, because people are trying to hide the truth. And all this has made the Russian military much, much weaker. So disinformation cuts both ways for Russia, makes it weaker, and did try to make the West weaker, but of course, that made the West stronger as everybody unified in the West. This is UK data. 1/3 of social media users first of all, they don't even consider the truthfulness of what they're reading. They just read it. They cannot spot the difference of true from fake, COVID, anti-vax, etc. In addition, 30% of British, that means everybody, social media users don't trust social media, but they do trust the BBC, which is interesting. A couple extra little points on information. The Ukrainian army has been the king of information. They work off of small decentralized units, very flexible, in which the leader of the unit has power instead of centralized power. But in each case, each unit has terrific access to information, about where the Russians are moving, logistics, you name it. A lot of the information does come from US and UK and other sources. Nonetheless, they have great access to information. Russia didn't even have sorry for the typos here. Russia was for a while, the military was using the Ukrainian mobile phone network to communicate unencrypted, so that US, Ukraine could find out what they were doing, what they were saying. So all this makes you think, what is information? Yeah, thinking about disinformation, just the above, and the military makes you think, what is information? And really, in many ways, the opposite of information is not disinformation, but it's noise. Information is what Shannon called signal, right? As distinct from noise. you had to have your channels, right? Your sender, your receiver, and then signal was successful. I mean, noise wasn't information. Information is when a message, right, gets from A to B successfully. It's signal and not noise. So this is similar in a lot of ways to Gregory Bateson's nonlinear information person, great cybernetics thinker. He was at all the cybernetic conferences. It was his definition. Information is a difference that makes a difference. So noise does not make a difference here. So noise isn't information, right? It's signal, yeah. But noise is also, it doesn't make a difference, first of all, because it just, makes everything unintelligible. But it's also not a difference in that bits of noise are not distinguishable from one another. So noise is not a set of differences. It's a set of almost sames and not differences. So it not only doesn't make a difference, but it's not a set of difference. You can't perceive noise. It's imperceptible in a way because it's just background, static. And here's what I think is important. Information is not just perceptible, it is intelligible. So information isn't just something that you perceive, but you have to perceive the difference, but you have to somehow, what would be the perception and intellection would be the opposite of, not the opposite, would be taking perception further. Yeah. Cognition is always intellection. It's not just perception, right? It's making something intelligible. It's making differences that make a difference to your intellect and not just your perception. Intelligibility, cognition, pretty much the same thing. And information is always has to be a question of knowing, because as we know that the information society is the knowledge society, right? So cognition or knowing is a question of intelligibility. That is making distinctions and cognizing or knowing, not just perception. It means knowing, but to know things is to bring them under a category. Yeah, it's to bring things under categories, under classifications, under frames, right? When you start using frame, just categories like man, woman, Korean, English, but all sorts of categories, mathematics versus science, all sorts of categories. That now we're moving into the sphere of intellection. Intelligibility, and probably information also means bringing something under a category. I mean, even us using the categories of information, disinformation, those are categories, right, of knowledge, that we're bringing across in this conference. Now, the other thing that cognition does, and we're getting close to AI here too, to the AI debates, artificial knowing, it works through inference, right? Inference, deductive inference, inductive inference, inference. Well, for example, a deductive inference is like a geometric proof. You take your axioms and you do deduction to get your theorems. Sherlock Holmes does deduction, right? Deductive inference. Inductive inference, you start from a fact and you work towards a conclusion. The famous all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, the most famous paradigmatic induction. But intelligence works through through inference, either deductive or inductive. So it brings things under categories, right? And works through induction. I think information does too. But it's about intelligence again. Intellection, cognition. Computers are inference machines. They take data in, use an algorithm to process the data, and they come out with processed data through inference. They're inference. Because the way we're looking at information as intelligence is also AI. The interesting thing here is also AI is not artificial information, right, guys? It's artificial intelligence, isn't it? Back to signal again, the famous study on the Chinese room, John Searle, where the computer can pass the Turing test, where the individual doesn't know in the other room, doesn't know if it's a computer or a human being, but the computer cannot understand Chinese. The computer doesn't have intentionality, doesn't have understanding, can't work with meaning. The computer can do the syntax, the rules or syntax, right? But it cannot do the semantics. It can't do the meaning of it. The semantics are the signal. The semantics are the information, the intelligibility. So we're back to signal again, semantics, AI, I guess, and the Chinese room. And the Chinese room, again, I think we're getting back to the case, the military case yet again. Okay, so we're talking, what is information? It's intelligibility and intellection or cognition. So we talk about computers as information machines, yet we talk about artificial intelligence. And as we argued in the last slide, that intelligence entails categories, right? On the one hand, as knowledge does in general, and inference. Your students write essays, they're always using categories and doing inference all the time, whether they're using data or just writing more theoretical essay, right? You guys mark essays like that all the time, right? Wonderful book, Philip K. Dick's Vast Active Living, not information system, but intelligence systems. But the operational term there is intelligence, not information, although it's also information as intelligence. Secondly, the other operative term is living. So what we're looking at is a living system, at intelligence that is alive. So now we're taking our model and our argument one step further and saying that we can often and should be often talking about intelligence as if it were alive. So that artificial intelligence is not just artificial cognition, but it's artificial life by extension. Living or life, and here we're referring to Hyeon Kim's teacher. Life is a question of negentropy. Physics, since for 150 years, understands the universe as entropic. But Earth is negentropic. We'll get back to that in a minute. By entropic, second law of thermodynamics, entropic means losing organization. It means disorganizing. It means decay. It means death, slowly death. We have the Big Bang, right? The origins of the universe. And from that moment on, it's entropy. It's decay, disorganization, reduction of complexity, and finally, and then death. It takes 3 or 4 billion years, of course, but it's still entropic. Life, on the other hand, is negentropic. It counters the law of entropy. The Earth, none of the other planets in our solar system and no other star that astronomers have been able to find have life. I'm sure there must be some somewhere, but 99.99% don't. Only Earth is negentropic. Only Earth has life. Only Earth is at a chemical disequilibrium. Only Earth has life, okay? I think that's really important. So this neganthropocene that Stigler talks about, Latour talks about the Anthropocene, that that humans are destroying life on Earth, as it were. But only Earth is negentropic. Okay. But the point I'm trying to make here, information is also negentropic. One can imagine how AI and artificial intelligence is, but also information is negentropic. That is, the God in the universe thing at the bottom, whereas the universe is entropic, Earth is negentropic, God is a universe thing. I'm not giving you any theology here, trying not to. Christ only comes to Earth. He's not on the universe. So Christ is into this kind of negentropic thing. And that's the interesting thing about the Dick Philip K. Dick book. It's Christ as a vast, active, living kind of intelligence system. I'm going to leave that, guys. That you don't have to listen to that last bit. But the important thing is that information will not always. Information in the way that I want to talk about it is negentropic. It's not always negentropic, but it often is. But I'll come to this in the next slide. You might have noticed that the frame of this lecture has been military action, hasn't it? And by extension, military intelligence, right? Winning wars in military intelligence. Well, in fact, historically, so much of information thinking comes, and disinformation too, of course, comes from military intelligence, from the military. Turing himself. But Norbert Wiener, cybernetics, Don Haraway writes about this big time, understands cybernetics, right, in terms of C3I. The C3 is command, top down, control, right, communication, and intelligence. Not information, but intelligence. You can see it. Trying to get intelligence on the enemy, trying to make it so the enemy cannot get intelligence on you, about control and coordination of your troops through a centralized command and chain of communication, hugely, hugely important. Might also include logistics. China, Russia, big mistakes. Sending all those tanks in, single file. They were just, and the Ukrainians knew where they were and they just destroyed them through little anti-tank weapons, a lot which came from the UK. Little tactical anti-tank weapon. But intelligence and us thinking about information, computation, digital media, et cetera, it comes from the bloody military, guys, not just from this war. Alan Turing himself. What did Alan Turing want to use the Turing machine for? Cracking the German code in World War II. So right away from the beginning, computation was about intelligence. So intelligence is at the heart of this. The young Turing, we hit on this before, and you guys have it in all your courses when you're teaching your students. The young Turing wrote about and talked about algorithms. Turing machine was based, and still is, based on algorithms. What does an algorithm do? Turing's big influence was the logician and mathematician Gödel. So for Gödel, Gödel's proofs, you start from an axiom and you work towards a theorem. And he saw algorithms as mediating in mathematics and in logic between axioms and theorems. Theorem is what you prove, right? Algorithms work inferentially, right? They work as inference between axioms and theorems. Well, deduction in this case. What Turing does is he takes these algorithms and he puts them into engineering. He puts them into a machine, not logic and not mathematics. And in this case now, the algorithm works between the data input, right? And the data output, which is whatever you get from your data output. So he moves it into engineering. And this is the basis of computing, what we have, digital media and everything like that. What was the input? Was it signal or noise? Well, the Turing machine has to know the difference, doesn't it? It's got to separate the noise from the signal, of course, and work it through, and then process it through information processing, right? Through algorithms, with the output being a conclusion, but it's not a conclusion that's true or false. It's a conclusion that works, that's operative, that's operational. And this is what Turing does. And this is the original notion, really, of that kind of information as intelligence in the Turing machine. This is another hunk of data, of information. But I did give a little bit of a lecture in this direction in Korea, a couple lectures just a few years ago. What do algorithms do? They come out with something like Google PageRank. taking a lot of data and doing that successfully. And I think there's, and Stiegler partly convinced, it's all about Alan Turing, and it's all about what information is. And I think that information can work as intelligence in two ways. And I'm improvising a bit here and thinking this through still. The late Turing, when Turing is young, well, he dies at age 42, doesn't he? Till about the age of 37, he does algorithms, logic, the Turing machine, mathematics from Gödel. And that kind of notion of cognition, although it's cognition made operational, the Turing machine. But the late Turing changes his thinking. And the late Turing writes about theoretical biology, but Google it and read it, classical pieces, and became really important in theoretical biology, and about the morphogenesis, which means the origins of life, the genesis of life. So right now we're moving towards a little bit thinking about also information as alive. And somehow I think AI has to work like that. AI has to work not just so you can crack the code of the Germans in the war. That's not even AI. That's, I think AI has to be more like life. The computer can pass the Turing test, right? For John Searle, in terms of speaking Chinese, because you're standing outside the Chinese room and you don't know if it's a computer or a human. But then there's the computer and it can't understand Chinese, can't do the semantics, can't do it's no intentionality there, no understanding, no meaning, right? That's the semantics. So the computer can't imitate life yet, can't do that yet. These are the two definitions, not definitions. They're the two ways that information works. So you get intelligibility, you get categorization, you get all that kind of stuff in the original Turing machine, but only in the later Turing theoretical biology that a lot of people are picking up on now. Do you get something that's closer to life, meaning, semantics, understanding? And computers aren't doing that quite yet, but that doesn't mean that they can't, where the information is alive. Whereas I say here, the information does the semantics. Here, what life is negentropic. Physical matter is entropic. Organic matter or life is negentropic. And Stiegler talks about the Anthropocene. I won't go into this. What does negentropic mean? Well, it's kind of obvious in a way. Once matter gets very, very high levels of organization, it becomes organic. It's alive. It gets intentionality. Life is DNA, RNA, and protein. Very highly organized molecules. Other HTO, inorganic molecules, don't have intention, don't have meaning, don't have life. Bateson was talking about this. For him, information was always negentropic, always at very high levels of organization. Because when the levels of organization get too low, you don't get signal, you get noise, you get decay, you get disorganization. The last little point is computer media literature that you guys will teach, Catherine Hales, Donna Haraway, and others, looks at kind of a second generation, and Bateson for that matter, second generation cybernetics, which is much more communicative, which is this biological notion, this morphogenetic notion of information, which is very positive, which is not about killing, as in war, or even that kind of intelligence, as how can I stop the enemy from killing, how can I kill them instead? But it's about sharing. It's about sharing. And indeed, give this lecture in Korea, the German word for communication is mitteilen, M-I-T-T-E-I-L-E-N, which means also sharing with. So information and information intelligibility as life. Negentropic can be about sharing. Intelligibility and information as death, to be very honest, to counteract and combat death. I mean, the US NATO has to have information to counteract the Russians, to counteract their disinformation, to counteract their bombs tearing Ukraine apart, which is just so sad. 40% of Ukrainians have lost their houses and homes. But that is not information as life. That's information as logic, information as algorithm, information that's much more on the mechanical model, not on the organic, in terms of organic thinking. But I just wanted to say that information as intelligibility can cut both ways. On the one, it can be mechanical, and we have to use mechanical thinking, mechanical stuff in war, but also in logical thinking when we're writing our essays. But when we're doing poetics, when we're doing imagination, when we're doing art, we're being much more organic here and using a different kind of information. Sorry, I started very, very simply, and I ended up very, very complexly in this lecture. Started out something very easy and it got very hard. Thinking about disinformation today makes you think about, it's a military context, right? So it makes you necessarily think about information and intelligence, right? Or information as intelligence in war. And the original model comes from there, Turing, Wiener. But then we have to see that there's another way, not necessarily another way of thinking, but another way that information works. Even information as information as intelligibility works. High levels of organization, it's organic, and Turing wrote about this too. It takes on life, and Bernard Stiegler for that matter. And as life, it's negentropic, and it's also in very, very many cases about a very positive notion of sharing. So sorry for the difficult stuff at the end, or not really. I hope I've given you a little bit of incentive to chase some of this stuff up and think about it yourselves, because I am. I think we all should be a bit. So anyway, thank you very much. Take care. I better go.
Thank you.